So yeah, Mark was just like I said, great intro because one of the things I was gonna touch on today is just how much fun Lewis Carroll has with words and word play and communication and foibles and all sorts of things in the book. The book is full of butchered verses and riddles and puns, and that's what makes it so much fun. You just never know where he's going to take you. And of course, a lot of the communication that happens in Wonderland is complete and utter nonsense. It's like people talking in circles, sentences that never go anywhere. But he allows us to kind of look outside of our own use of language and words and to kind of again outside the box, kind of go like, oh, and he points to things. Interesting to look at what he points at. I mean, language, like what you were saying, Mark, language is so secondhand and innate to us that we think we're communicating clearly. We don't even necessarily question that if we're, communicating with another person or a large group of people. We just assume that our message is getting across. That's not always true. Um, there's a lot of things I think we take for granted. And of course, words and language is, I mean, that's an amazing part of being human. Poetry, literature, philosophy, all those things. But again, there's this kind of sometimes downside to all the words and the information that's coming at us day to day in the modern world. Information overload, word noise, on the internet, like, snarky stuff being bandied about, um, just, words being used as weapons and things like that. But in the beginning was the word, right? In the beginning was the word. The word is one of those things one of the major things that separates us from the other animals. It's this an ability to communicate with language and how complex language has gotten and how much it allows us. I mean, on the one hand, it does allow us to connect, right? Like we're doing now. It allows us to get on the same page, pun intended. It allows us to come together. It allows us to share. But at the same time, words are really symbols, they're pointers, right? You can never actually know that a person is fully understanding you. And it's actually hard to 100% understand another person because these words are actually, they're limited. Like we can never really understand another person's experience fully, a person's lived experience. So we have these great tools, and tools do allow us to share emotionally and otherwise. But we need to remember that, right? Like words are limited. They can be very impoverished when it comes to sharing another person's experience. And that's why miscommunications and misunderstandings happen, right? Like you were saying, you can you can read something on the internet and you have no idea what happened leading up to that for that person. Likewise, they may be reading your comment out of context, so there are these words on the page, but there's so much underneath that we may or may not be getting. But the same is true with interpersonal communication too, right? This is why, people end up in couples counseling because, they're not hearing each other. They're not understanding each other. And so we have these words and this language that we're using, but it's not always fully conveying what's underneath. And it is funny, like kind of again what you were saying, that it's sometimes we're surprised by the miscommunication. Like we're just used to using language and words automatically. We're almost caught off guard when it doesn't work, and yet a lot of the time it's not working really, and it's working the best it can. But again, it's like it is there are these limits. So there's like an exchange in Wonderland, which I thought was a fun illustration of this. Because Alice is confused a lot of the time, right? She's trying to follow these conversations and they're just going all over the place. And she's like, but wait, she's always trying to kind of get back on board and she's losing her way constantly. So at one point, the March Hare says, you should say what you mean. And Alice says, well, I do. At least I mean what I say. That's the same thing, you know? And then the Mad Hatter says, not the same thing a bit. You might as well just say that I see what I eat is the same as I eat what I see. You might as well just say that I like what I get is the same as I get what I like. And you might just as well say, says the Dormouse, that I breathe when I sleep is the same thing as I sleep when I breathe. And the Hatter says, well, it is the same thing with you. So, but you know, that's just a fun example of like how this wordplay kind of points out like how language can get so fouled up and meanings can be twisted around and, you know, in a fun way here, but in reality, not always so fun. I mean, one of my jobs as a coach and a counselor is, you know, we were always trained that you should never assume that you know what a person's words mean when you're listening to them. And so that's where the, you know, depth of psychological inquiry comes from, because words can mean something totally different to the person in front of you than you think. And so, you know, there's this whole process of trying to get underneath the words. Like what are you actually talking about? I mean, just this simple word love, right? I mean, in the English language, love encompasses like everything. Of course, other languages have more nuanced words for different kinds of love, but you can love ice cream. You can love another person. You can love your cat. You can love, you know, you can have universal love for all things. It's just love can mean so many things depending on the context. And then you take a person with their entire experience of love, which can be sometimes good and bad and, you know, not necessarily all good, or their understanding of love, right? I mean, how can you unpack that? I mean, that's years. You can take years of therapy to unpack the one word love. So, but words are incredible. They're incredible tools that we have, right? Again, separates us from the other creatures. And they can be music to one's ears. They can be poetry or great literature or lyrics and songs. They can be used to woo another person. So words are beautiful. Authors, poets, philosophers, wits, comedians, they all use words in wonderful ways. They make us feel good. They make us laugh. These are the amazing ways that words serve us. Words are great in conversation among friends. Words are used for sharing experience. So we love words. And yet there's a dark side, right? There's always a dark side. Words can be used for misinformation and disinformation. They can be used to persuade or manipulate or indoctrinate or radicalize. Politicians, cult leaders, news media, advertisers, lawyers, they all understand this persuasive power of words. In Wonderland, Humpty Dumpty says, a word means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. So the speaker decides what the word means, and this can be done in a calculated way, or it can just be done unconsciously. Like most of us are speaking words unconsciously, you know, aware of what we're meaning. Take a word like freedom. Like, I mean, a lot of politicians, capitalists use this word a lot to get people on board with their agenda. It's like, well, you have the freedom to buy whatever you want. You know, don't let anyone take that freedom away from you. Or they hate us for our freedom. Or, you know, I remember after 9/11, there was some fast food restaurant that was selling freedom fries. You know, so there's ways in which these words can be used again to manipulate. And since the beginning of time, humans have attempted to really master the world through words. I mean, that's kind of one of the things we learn to do. Like in the beginning, it's like good to be able to label a poisonous plant so you won't eat that poisonous plant. You know, it's good to be able to label that and then label this other one. This is a good plant. Label things rock, sun, flower. to be able to, make sense of the world and communicate it. And a lot of times we feel like we gain some control through words and labels. And if you think of, for example, disease, like classifying diseases gives us a sense of control over these diseases, which can, kill us potentially, or at the very least make us sick. But if we can if we can diagnose a disease, then we can control it. We can contain it, hopefully. But as we all know, labels can also work against us. The label can become its own trap when we take them too literally, or we become too identified with our own labels or with the labels we're putting on other people, gender labels, ethnic labels, all those things. So and Lewis Carroll is always poking fun at human behavior and language and all of that. I mean, that's what he has, that's his art form, is parody and and just making fun and wordplay. So there is this chapter called A Caucus Race and a Long Tail, which is I think a great example of this, because he has two double entendres in that title. There's the caucus race, race is the word, and then there's the long tail. And so with the caucus race, everyone has just gotten out of the pool of tears, right? And they're soaking wet because Alice had cried the tears, and then they all started to swim around in the pool of tears and found themselves soaking wet. And so they're trying to figure out how to get dry again. So the mouse has an idea. He says, oh, well, this is the driest thing I know. And so he starts to recite this boring historical text. And so he's going on, he's droning on and on and on. Of course, no one's getting dry. But he says at one point, the Archbishop of Canterbury found it advisable. And then the duck goes, found what? Because in this case, the word it has no meaning. It doesn't have an antecedent. So there's this whole back and forth about what is it talking about? What is it referring to? And the duck says, when I use the word it, I'm usually talking about a bird or a fish or something I'm trying to chase. What does it mean? And, again, Carroll is just kind of pointing out this arbitrary use of words that we just kind of take for granted. All right, so the dry recitation does not get them dry. So the dodo bird has an idea. Let's have a caucus race. That'll dry us off. So this is the caucus race, which of course race meaning athletic race and also meaning political caucus. And so what that is everybody just starts kind of like going around in a circle, just like walking around, running in a circle, stopping and starting at different times. It's really kind of chaotic. And, finally the dodo's like, okay, the race is over. And you know what? Everybody's a winner and everybody gets prizes. And it's just ridiculous. And of course, the whole time Alice is like, this is ridiculous. What is going on here? But it's also, again, is it that much more ridiculous than our political system? I mean, than our caucus races, than our political races, people running in circles, talking in circles, nonsense being spewed about. I don't know that it is. So again, it's like silliness, but it's also pointing at human behavior and kind of the silliness of our own behavior, our own habits. And this word race, though, is like talk about a word with a lot of meanings to it, right? I mean, you have race as in the ethnic use of the term, right? Race with a capital, of critical race theory, race used as, again, a weapon or a way to categorize people, a way to, make people superior or inferior. And so that's a huge use of the word. Then you have in Wonderland, you have it's a political race as well as a athletic competition. And then I also, this lyric came to mind from a song by the Police from years and years and years ago, Synchronicity 2, where Sting is singing about people who are packed like lemmings into shiny metal boxes, contestants in a suicidal race. And I thought that's a great example of this double entendre with race, because it's the human race. The whole human race is kind of a suicidal race if you think about all the capabilities we have to like destroy ourselves instantly, right? It seems like we're maybe kind of suicidal. You've got the nuclear war over here, you have climate change, you have all these things. Not that we did climate change on purpose, but we're not doing anything to stop it really. So, but then you also have these people packed like in lemmings in shiny metal boxes in the rat race, racing like they think that they're racing to the top. Some of them do, but it's really more like a race to the bottom. And, some people may think they're like getting money, status, and power out of this race. But ultimately, we're all racing over a cliff, So race is a really, I thought was just a really interesting word that happened to be, used in this particular chapter. Just again, another example of how words can be played with over and over again in a way that's meaningful or a way that's nonsense. I mean, that's the thing that, you know, Lewis Carroll helps us laugh about it, right? He kind of helps us laugh about this absurdity that we're all existing in, this suicidal race, or the races that we're in, the competitions that we're in, the competitions that go nowhere, really. But yeah, and that sort of leads to I'd say, if you're thinking about words strung together are stories, and stories are become beliefs, like stories that we kind of listen to over and over again and internalize become beliefs, and then belief systems become a culture. And so it all kind of starts with this use of words and concepts. If you even think about capitalism as a story, capitalism is a story that we tell ourselves. It was based on theories that came from people's imaginations, based on words like concepts such as scarcity and self-interest and competition. And all of those words have been used over and over and over again to make a point and to get us to buy into the story. So the whole way we operate kind of hinges on certain terms and concepts. But capitalism is a story that was made up, and we all bought into it at a certain point. A lot of people are unbuying it, but we still live in this story. We still live in the story of capitalism. But that's one of the things that I think is worthwhile, is to try and think outside of the story and the terms. Like scarcity and competition are these things that were supposedly based on, natural selection. But in nature, there's also abundance, and there's also cooperation. So those happen just as much, if not more, than scarcity and competition. And there's also a huge question as to, self-interest. Yes, self-interest drives us, but also we need each other, and we're part of a whole. And so, if you start even questioning some of those things, it blows holes in the whole story. So all stories are basically made up in the imagination. Words are concepts that we use to label things in the world, and ideas that we dreamed up. And that became our culture. So it's when you really think about all of how the building blocks of culture really started with words like hundreds of thousands of years ago, and now we have these complex systems that were born out of that. So all of this gets to kind of like a couple of points that I wanted to make, which is that So much of our lives right now are bombarded by words, like all the time. Social media, mainstream media, a lot of people work with word heavy work, like you're reading things all day long, you're talking to people all day long. There's just a lot of noise. It's very noisy. So, and it can be hard to think. Yeah, exactly. It can be hard to think straight if you're in one of these like really heavy, heavy meeting kind of a life work, job, or lots of reading or whatever it is. Like you're just being bombarded all day long by information. And so part of that is, you can't control, but it's good to sort of just take note, like, what are the words I'm consuming? And who's using these words and how? What stories am I believing? What spin am I believing? What spin am I noticing? And what spin am I believing? What meaning am I making out of these words? It's like we all are taking in a lot of data all day long. And so many of us, might be doing this automatically, but sometimes even it's really the things that we assume that are the most dangerous things, right? Those are the ones that we need to question our assumptions. Because, unless you're on the ground in a particular situation, you're always trusting someone else to tell you the story, which means it's coming through their own biases and subjective experience. So that was one point, is just, taking inventory of the words and the stories that you're consuming. And then the other one is, or there's three of them, but the second one is just communication, right? So like you were talking about earlier, how is what I'm saying being received? And is it something that I need to clarify? Is it something that I need to make more clear? Because maybe I'm not being clear. Maybe I'm assuming they understand what I'm saying, or maybe I'm not giving them context. And vice versa. Like, what am I assuming about what they're saying? Maybe I need to dig a little deeper. Maybe I need to find out more about where that came from. Because a word can mean one thing to one person and something completely different to another based on their experience. The other play on words from that chapter, the caucus race and the long tail, is the long tail, the very long tail. Because the mouse is talking about his long, sad tail, as in his long, sad story. And Alice thinks he's talking about his long, sad tail. So, checking, what are you talking about? Otherwise, there's a lot of miscommunication. But again, Carroll gives us humor. He gives us, and that's one way to deal with all this kind of the absurdity and the arbitrary nature of all these things, is with humor. Humor and laughter is transcendence of the human condition. We're all dealing with this limited language, and we're kind of making a mess of it a lot of times, but we can also laugh about that. So, and then the third thing that we can do is take breaks from the words, take breaks from the stories, because again, anything that's really word-based or a story-based, whether it's about ourselves or about other people or the world, is all self-created, imagined. It's all imagined. I mean, even if it's a story that we've consumed, we're making it our own, right? We're taking that story and we're kind of running with it. So taking breaks from words, right? Through silence, stillness, meditation is a good way to do that. Even if you're observing the words, you're really tuning into the presence, the presence without words, because the truth of lived experience is actually beyond the words. It's in the felt experience in the here and now. That's the closest thing to truth we can get. It's just being here, being tuned in, being present. So carving time out, quality time, to shut out all the noise, all the words, all the stories, and, with mindful activities, walks, dancing or watching dance, listening to music, painting, meditation, seeking out quiet and presence. Again, it's the truth of what is. But just to finish, and I forgot to actually show you this, my mug today, because it's the Cheshire Cat. I just forgot.
That's excellent.
But obviously, one of the great joys of life is stories. The books, the movie, the poetry, the great conversation, the good company, the tea party, right? One of the great things in life is the words and the stories. So when we choose to engage with the words, let's turn towards the words that bring us pleasure, the good conversation, the literature, the poetry, the comedy, the inspirational writing, because words are powerful and they can really make us feel good. They're also immensely fun. So I wanted to leave you with a couple of my favorite examples of wordplay. And one is from Alice. The door says, "Why, it's simply impassable." And Alice says, "Why, don't you mean impossible?" And the door says, "No, I mean impassable, because nothing's impossible." So I love that. It's just a little inspirational thing to leave with. And then a couple of others that I love. Mae West, "You ought to get out of those wet clothes and into a dry martini." And then, oh, a couple from Dorothy Parker, of course. One, "You can't teach an old dogma new tricks." Nope. And then another Dorothy, "I'd rather have a bottle in front of me than a frontal lobotomy." So that's where I'll leave you with some fun wordplay. So